Welcome to Special Education Legal Fund's April 6th webinar entitled Mental Health, Special Education, and the Law. My name is Christine Lai, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of S.E.L.F, and I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists this evening, as well as all the attendees to tonight's webinar. We are thrilled and delighted to acknowledge our 2022 corporate partners. S.E.L.F is both privileged and blessed to have the support of so many amazing independent schools and programs, so many that I actually had some trouble fitting them all on this page. We are delighted to welcome our 2022 corporate partners, Winston Preparatory School at the gold level, at the silver level, American School for the Deaf, Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, Shrub Oak International School, Villa Maria School, Fusion Academy, and at the bronze level, Eagle Hill School and Windward School. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. I'm just going to say a couple words about S.E.L.F for those of you who are new to us or may not be as familiar. Special Education Legal Fund, or S.E.L.F, was founded just about 4 years ago in 2018 to provide grants for families in need with children in the special education system. And since our founding, we have provided over $500,000 in grants to over 150 families in over 50 school districts across Connecticut and Westchester County. We are an entirely volunteer nonprofit organization founded by parents for parents. Our mission since before we were founded, has been to provide families with the knowledge and resources to better navigate and understand the special education system. We could not do what we do without the support of people like you. As I said before, we are an entirely volunteer organization. And what does that mean? That means that I don't take a salary. It means we don't have salaried employees. We only have volunteers. And it means that nearly all of our donations, aside from the administrative costs of running a nonprofit organization, go directly to support families that need it, families like you. Any amount, no matter the size, helps us to continue to support parents through our grants program and through this free webinar series. So if you would like to support S.E.L.F with a donation of any kind, any size, anything helps us, please visit our website at www.spedlegalfund.org. I will put that in the chat, but right now it's at the bottom of the screen. And thank you very much in advance for your support. A little advertisement for our next webinar in May, on May 11th. The topic is going to be finding the right school, an educational consultant's view. I'm really excited about this, webinar because I don't, I previously had not been real familiar with exactly what an educational consultant does and how they fit into this, pantheon of support that one, at various times in your educational career, your child's career, needs to look out for. So we are really, really excited to present this with two very highly regarded educational consultants. We're going to talk about, really how parents can find and assess a school and figure out if it's the right fit for their child. So we're really excited about that. That's May 11th. You can register for that in the same Eventbrite link that you use to register for this webinar. Sorry. Can you see my share? Is it share?
Yeah, it's both the slide and the other slides. So
okay, interesting.
Yeah.
You know what? Let me stop that and start it again because it just said your share is paused, which seems weird. Okay.
It wasn't in presentation mode. There you go.
Oh, now it's in presentation.
All right. Apologize.
No worries.
Weird. Okay. So sorry for that little technical glitch. I'm going to spend 2 seconds talking about our advocacy support program. This is a program that we launched in the spring of 2021. We were really excited about it because we have been trying to layer in advocacy support for families really pretty much since we were founded. So this program provides families in need with $1,000 in special education advocacy support from a qualified advocate from the list that we provide. We review these grants, these grant requests as with our, our core program, the legal assistance program. We review these on a monthly basis during the school year. And if you're interested in this program or want more information, please visit our website. That is how you begin the application process. Just briefly on this next slide, I'm going to show the requirements for this program as it is slightly different from the legal assistance program. Families are eligible if they have an income level that is below 300% of the federal poverty line, which is sort of, 300% of this middle line or 3 times this middle line. And you have a child or children with an IEP or a 504 plan. You also must reside in Connecticut. So if all 3 of those things are true and you think that you need the support of an advocate, please visit our website, reach out to us, and start the application process. And so here we begin. We are delighted to welcome Dana Jonson, attorney Dana Jonson, to this webinar. Dana is, I don't know actually what number of webinars this is for you. I can't remember, but she's one of my favorite people, one of the most favorite people I've met since starting S.E.L.F. And I'm really excited that she signed up for this webinar in particular, because Dana is a passionate and dedicated advocate for children with disabilities. And she also walks the walk as well as talks the talk. She is a parent who's walked this road that we all have walked for her own children and for the multiple foster children that she has been privileged to support over the years. So welcome back, Dana.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. Another one of my favorite people that I have met since starting S.E.L.F. is Piper Paul. Piper is a great friend and supporter of S.E.L.F. and an amazing attorney. This is her, I think, 4th appearance on a S.E.L.F. panel. Is that right? Something like that, 4. She actually did an in-person panel back when we were still doing those kinds of things. But she's been on panels for us, including topics like residential outplacement, understanding special education law, the big one that we did, but the last one we did in person, which was evaluations to environment and more. And we're super excited to have Piper join us again. Welcome back. Diane Willcutts is our next panelist. We are thrilled to have her on this webinar. She's been a guest on several panels of ours, and we're just thrilled to have her expertise on this subject today. You all heard me speak a few minutes ago about the Advocacy Support Program. What I didn't mention that then and will now is that advocates on our list that we provide grants to through that program are advocates like Diane. The advocates on our list are all recommended by 1 or more special education attorneys. They go through that vetting process. And in Diane's case, she actually was recommended by more than 4 attorneys separately. And there was really only 1 other advocate that, that achieved that level of recommendation. So, very highly experienced in all areas of special education advocacy, with varying students of, many different learning profiles. So welcome back, Diane.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, and I wasn't even on your page. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
there's Diane's.
that's fine.
I really need to pull it together tonight. Obviously, this is, it's like my first time. And finally, last but not least, is our final panelist is Dr. Adrian Smaller. Dr. Smaller is assistant clinical professor of psychology at the Yale Child Study Center. As well as having a private practice, she consults all over the state to various schools and centers regarding diagnosis, care, treatment of children with disabilities. I myself have known Dr. Smaller for, like 10 years now. I was privileged, I think you were our 2nd neuropsych, number 2 out of 7. So, I have had the just immense pleasure of knowing Dr. Smaller and, and experiencing her work for many years. And we are so excited that she could be on this panel with us this evening.
Thank you.
So finally, because it wouldn't be a webinar without a disclaimer, this webinar panel is presented for informational purposes only. This webinar is intended as a resource for families who are navigating the special education system in Connecticut and New York. It is not intended to provide to replace the advice or counsel of a qualified special education attorney. This webinar should not be construed as an endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives of any of the participating members of the panel. For webinar participants, this panel should be viewed as a public forum. Please do not ask questions via the Zoom platform, either in the Q&A or the chat, about your child or your child's legal or educational situation. If you have questions, please email them to me. I will put my email address in the chat. It's Christine@spedlegalfund.org. I'll do it in a minute. In your question, please refrain from any identifying information about your child, including name, grade, school, or school district. And please remember, of course, that your screen name may be visible to the participants in the panel, as well as everyone at Special Education Legal Fund. This webinar is being recorded and may be distributed or shown at a later date at the discretion of Special Education Legal Fund. So, mental health, special education, and the law. It sounds kind of obvious, to say the least, to say that we are in the midst of a mental health crisis among our children. But obvious or not, it's true. I know that we here at S.E.L.F. have seen a tremendous increase in the number of applicants in the last year or so that have presented with significant mental health challenges. It's a huge increase even versus just a few years ago, and even since the start of the pandemic. Some of these, students that are struggling with mental health challenges, don't have primary learning disabilities. So I think that this represents a particular challenge to both the students themselves and their families that are helping, try to navigate, this crisis. So we've convened this panel of experts to talk about these challenges and what they've seen, but also to talk about, what's available, what resources are out there, and even what to do and how to proceed, if you're at the start of this journey. So, I'd like to kind of start this off, by, throwing this question out generally to the panel, which is, what changes have you seen, in your own practice and what you do with students since the beginning of the pandemic? Adrienne, I'm going to pick on you and start first, because I think I'm not going to say that your practice has changed the most, but, I feel like I don't understand as much about how your practice has changed, in terms of the evaluation process and how it's like to move that online, and, and how you were, and how you and other, psychologists and clinical psychologists did that. So, why don't you start?
Sure. It has been a challenge that we have never seen. None of us had ever imagined that we would be in the situation that we came into in March of 2020. In the last 2 years, I have to say that, half of my practice is children with social and emotional issues. The other half is evaluations, doing psychological testing. So any child that I had seen previous to the pandemic who had any sort of issue with anxiety or depression came back to me during the pandemic. So it exacerbated any child with a pre-existing condition of anxiety and depression. That said, it also triggered so many other vulnerable children. And it was, it was an epidemic, basically. Both my husband and I are in the profession, and I remember us getting off Zoom one night thinking, I'm not sure if we can really do this, if we can really address the need. It had gotten to the point where in 1 week, I think I had to send 4 children to the emergency department.
Wow.
So it was really something that we had never experienced in our very long career.
Mm-hmm.
So that said, how to reconstitute and sort of figure out how to meet those needs. Thank goodness for Zoom. We all learned that pretty quickly. And it worked for some children. It was hard for families. It was hard when you're used to that sort of face-to-face contact and reading children's expressions and, really being at one with them in a session. So that was challenging. Now that I'm starting to see kids face-to-face, it's just such a relief. It's just amazing. There certainly were positives in that we were able to reach people through Zoom, and parents who, had a hard time finding people, traveling distances, as we talked about tonight. So that was something that at least we were more accessible. Just in terms of the psychological testing, in March of 2020, I had 16 evaluations scheduled that would have gone through the summer, and that all had to be stopped, that all had to be paused. And it took about 2 to 3 months for Pearson, who publishes the psychological tests, as well as the American Psychological Association, as well as my work with the Yale Child Study Center, for all these heads to come together and sort of figure out how we're going to do this and how we're going to meet the needs. And so lots of training went out, and luckily we were able to do that virtually. And it took me about 3 months of training to really feel confident that I could do a virtual assessment. And it had to be the right child, the right referral question. I did have a special ed director question the validity of that, and I had to sort of, guide her toward the research that had been done on virtual telehealth and also virtual assessment. So we were lucky in that way. And from that point, we moved to the plexiglass and the masks in the office just to do the psychological testing. And so it was really challenging. And I've met with so many kids over the last couple of weeks who are having this anniversary reaction. That it was
Right.
2 years ago, March 13th.
Mhm.
And I think that we all have to pause and really sort of reflect on that, because it has been something that we have never, ever experienced.
It's interesting because it also coincided with the removal of a lot of school mask mandates, the anniversary and the mask mandate removal. And that actually, I think, brought with it some anxiety as well. Because a lot of kids, like little kids that don't remember going to school without a mask, kids that haven't, it's really, the mask, I think, was helpful for some children, that, have, anxiety and depression, because they it kind of masks their face, so, which is a dumb thing to say, but, you couldn't see if they were really sad, or, whatever. And so, and losing that, security blanket, I think, was difficult too. But anyway, that's an aside. Diane, would you like to talk a little bit next about how your practice has shifted over the, how your advocacy practice has changed over the last couple of years?
Right. The most obvious change for me, because I've always worked with kids with anxiety and school anxiety and things like that, the biggest change was not having to drive everywhere, having all these Zoom meetings, and I do not miss it. I have to say, I am totally content to be able to actually work with families. It's nice; they don't have to pay travel fees, and
Babysitters,
we can,
et cetera.
we can fit things in more quickly. So that part's been positive. What I did see with some of my students with a lot of school anxiety was that some of them were really happy when everything shut down. They thrived with virtual learning. So, if anything, coming back has been challenging to try to meet their needs coming back in. And in particular, I mean, there are students who have difficulties navigating social situations. Some of my kids with high functioning autism in particular were pleased to not have that stress. There are some kids who have been bullied, and they were relieved to not be present. So I haven't so much noticed a lot more anxiety at this point, just because that was a percentage of my caseload anyway. But it definitely, as I said, there were definitely some bonuses for some kids. And and coming back, that part has been challenging, going back in person. And we have run into more school refusal, or what's called school refusal, as a result. I mean, I think being out for that amount of time and realizing, hey, this is working for me. It's been challenging that way.
I mean, I think that, it's, we were all sort of trying to figure it out, right, in the beginning. I mean, I know, what our experience was itself was that, everything kind of stopped, and then obviously because everyone was figuring out what to do and how to react and what was the legal situation going to be like. And also because, people come to us and come to you, to all of you, in the midst of a crisis, and if you're not going to school, most of the time, at least initially, the crisis is not happening daily. You're not getting called by the school. Kids not being bullied. They're not being shoved into a locker. All that stuff isn't happening. So initially there was a huge amount of relief, but then we've also seen in the fall of this year, as people went back in person, and not halftime, not remote, not, whatever, there's a huge surge then. I thought our surge in October of, fall of 2020 was the pig and the python thing, because there were all these cases backed up from schools being closed. And then we had another surge in 2021 because everyone had to go back to school and they weren't ready or prepared, or they couldn't ease into it. Or it was just here we are, we're back just like we were before. And kids were like, no, it's not like that. So I definitely saw that as well. Dana, I'd love to hear from you about your practice and your experience, over the last couple of years with.
Oh, yeah. Interestingly, in January of 2020, my office went paperless and virtual. So when the world shut down, we were actually quite prepared for that component. That was the only piece. Personally, I entered the pandemic with two of my children whose primary disability categories were ED. And I came out of the pandemic with 3 children whose primary category was ED. So I addressed this both on a personal level and a professional level. In my office, what has completely exploded and is entirely our caseload right now is either reading or mental health. It's reading or mental health. And I think everyone suddenly was home with their kids and realized how not independent they were at reading directions and stuff like that, where they were getting cues from the classroom that supplemented their inability to read. So I think that was one thing. And then the mental health piece. Diane, to your point, my oldest, when they shut down, she couldn't have been happier. She was living her best life. She was like, are you telling me I never have to leave home and I have to be on a computer all the time? This is fabulous. Yeah, she couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah.
It was kind of funny though, because they switched her aide during that time, and the new aide didn't understand her. And it was absolutely hilarious to us to see them try and connect over them. It was just, if you have that kind of household, those things are funny. But it's really been, and one of my children initially was a school refusal issue. So this was pre-pandemic that we had a school refusal issue. And I remember those days of being told by everybody, you have to send them in, you have to send them in, you have to force them in. And it was making it worse and worse and worse. And so I've been through that component personally. And now it's everywhere. I mean, it was a little bit of an anomaly back then when my son first had his issues. And I shouldn't say an anomaly. I mean, as Diane said, we've had anxiety cases forever. Like the mental health piece isn't new to us. It just hasn't been the primary of all of my cases before. And I used to say, for years, I said the mental health cases are the hardest. For me personally, emotionally, we all have that type of case or type of kid that just pulls a cord. And for me, it was mental health. And now it's everything. And in our office, we've stopped taking cases at right now the second, but which I probably shouldn't say on a huge thing, but my point being is that it's a lot. I think it's hard for us to remember as professionals. Sometimes we can't handle all these cases, because I'm getting calls all day, every day about the kid who is not being helped in school or texting their private therapist that they're going to kill themselves today or, whatever it is. And we get barraged by all of this information all day, every day. And I think we forget as professionals that it's hard for us too. So it's impacting everybody in a way that I don't even think we can articulate.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because obviously I don't do what you do. So I don't, I don't have that sense. I tend to see a family, kind of one time, at the, the apex of the crisis, or the nadir, whatever the word is, and then, if we can provide them with support, we provide them with support. They hire somebody like you, and then and then 6 months later, I hear, it's good, or whatever. But we don't get that daily, that day. I don't get that daily deluge, and I quite frankly don't know how you all, especially Dr. Smaller, and and because I know you guys all. You're not supposed to, but you can't help but function, as a sort of therapist, in a way, because you're listening to people's problems and trying to solve them. So I totally get that. Piper, I know, you're last but not least. I know that mental health is, really close to your heart. And I think at this point, it forms almost the entirety of your, of what you're working on at the moment in your caseload. Talk about what you've seen in the last couple of years.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone's experienced a tremendous amount of trauma, not just the students, but the families. And this includes school personnel, it includes attorneys, advocates. We're really trying to work on a different platform. A majority of my cases have always been come in as mental health. I have not ever believed that was actually the diagnosis. I think that's often an easy diagnosis. And when students have really complex profiles with sensory challenges and social challenges, and language challenges, and academic challenges, that they can easily get labeled emotionally disturbed. And I think it is a fallacy. And I think that in my practice, there are very few students that truly that is the diagnoses. I believe in neuroplasticity, and I think the brains have really gotten dinged in a lot of people. The parents for the first time saw what was actually going on and saw that their child maybe couldn't read, couldn't pay attention, and they became really, really scared. I am concerned that districts are easily labeling students as emotionally disturbed when there may be some profound child find violations, and that's an easy diagnosis that will not work. So although that's the majority of my practice, it has always been a fight that I've had, that it is unfair to label someone as emotionally disturbed unless you understand their entire profile. And on a side note, as far as having to work with people, it's a whole new ballgame now. People are suffering, and I do think it's the repercussions of trauma. And people take positions, it's harder to listen, and it's everybody. So it's really a very challenging time to work, and it's a time to try to pause and listen, but it is very challenging right now.
Thank you, everyone. You've kind of segued into something that, this is skipping a couple questions on my list, but, labels or classifications. What types of IEP classifications, are most commonly seen for students with, with mental health challenges? Obviously, we're talking a little bit about, emotional disturbance, about ED. Do these classifications matter? Why or why not? And how do they affect services and supports, or do they? So, I would love to, let's start with Diane, just to mix things up a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, students with, mental health issues can be classified under emotional disturbance or other health impaired typically. I think Piper made a good point that a lot of times when we're seeing a child with a mental health issue, a lot of the time there's something underlying it. I mean, I have a child who, oh my gosh, they're so anxious and they have trouble paying attention, and really it's because they can't read.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really hard to be in school and see everyone else doing, whatever they're doing and not being able to keep up. So there's that. But generally, a student with a mental health issue goes under emotional disturbance, which is a title that everyone hates. They're actually trying to get change through the legislature to have it called emotional disability, which I think would
just way
make
better.
a lot of people feel better. Yeah. And, but technically, it doesn't matter what box is checked. Technically, in theory, whether it's under other health impaired or emotional disturbance or learning disability or whatever, the district is required to meet all the needs of the child. So in theory, it's not supposed to have an impact on services, but in reality, sometimes people judge. I mean, they look at the primary disability category. Oh, sorry. They look at the primary disability category and they, make assumptions about the child.
Do you, Dana, what's your thought on this, on the labels, both, I mean, obviously you know it well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I hate emotional disturbance because they're not disturbed.
Nothing makes me madder than a 5-year-old child with an ED label. That makes me absolutely
right.
insane,
How messed up is that?
You're just lazy. You didn't do the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, that being said, on the other hand, how am I going to get a therapeutic placement for a kid who doesn't have an emotional disturbance label? It is a harder battle. So it's tough, and it is tough with the labels. I personally, I feel like, if a child has a hearing impairment or ADHD or an auditory processing disorder, those 3 kids are going to present the exact same way in the classroom. But if you try to treat one of them like they have one of the other things, you're not going to see any progress. So in that regard, yeah, I do think that the labels are important to some degree to help us understand. But to, everyone else's point is, rarely do I see emotional issues pop out of nowhere. Especially if they're young teen girls with emotional issues, that child I know immediately they have not been properly programmed for about 10 other reasons, probably. And, particularly kids who are more cognitively inclined, they can mask a lot of that.
Yeah.
So they can hide it and nobody sees it until it's way too far.
Yeah.
So there, it is a really hard thing with the labels, and I get it. Some states allow more than one primary disability category. We only allow one, which I think is ridiculous. Because sometimes there isn't one that is the primary, especially when you're talking about emotional issues. If a child has autism and emotional issues, how are you teasing that out? How are you making that decision that one is over the other? And I'm not usually sitting at a table full of people qualified to make that decision. And so it's, and I am finding, at least now, sorry, it's the end of the day, I'm all riled up. At the end of the day, I'm finding more and more school districts fighting with professionals. And, I'm sitting at the table with someone like Adrienne, and they're like, nope, sorry, we just don't see that. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
We have a Yale psychologist sitting here giving you information, and you're like, nah.
Or questioning the validity of the evaluation, Adrienne.
Right. My English degree makes me better than that. I mean, it's infuriating.
Yeah.
And
actually, Dana, I once had a special ed director say to me, a child can be diagnosed with schizophrenia and not be eligible for special education. So, and we didn't talk about, maybe you and Piper could talk about that severity and duration checklist that we have to go through with parents to even get that classification. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. That would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really extreme checklist. And if they're getting that checklist out, that is a red flag to you, because they are labeling your child as emotionally disturbed. And that's a concern, because they're labeling a student, and unfortunately, emotionally disturbed is dismissive. I've been doing this for about 17 years. I can only think of 2 cases off the top of my head that was truly emotionally disturbed. It could be a nonverbal learning disability. It could be sensory integration. It could be
autism. It could be
autism, and it's missed. And students that act out behaviorally end up with behavior play. I have a student, no joke, in high school, bright. He works for a reward to get a stuffed animal. Outrageous.
Yeah.
Because he's emotionally disturbed. And the disconnect is that people don't understand what emotionally disturbed is. And they don't understand that if you are schizophrenic or if you do have a serious disability, that is not a medical condition. That is part and parcel to the ability to be educated. And it's social, emotional, adaptive, behavioral, and academic. It is all of the above. It is not just academic. And unless you can be regulated in a therapeutic environment, you cannot learn. And that ultimately is the district's responsibility.
So how do you, I mean, I think that we've all kind of touched on, how, generally speaking, anxiety and depression don't exist in a vacuum, from, whatever the presenting condition might be, whether it be ADHD that was masked or, or dyslexia that was, kids are really, really good at, compensating, and taking cues from other people. How do you, this is actually, a question from the audience, how does the district serve multiple diagnoses or multiple classifications in, like an ADHD and and an anxiety or, whatever, how do we, deal with that in an IEP and then, maybe in a 504 plan as well? Who wants to take that first? I don't want to call
Right,
in. I feel like a teacher.
I'm just jumping in.
Yeah, absolutely.
They can address all of those things. I mean, even if they say that one is primary, the IEP still has to address all areas of need. So if I have a child who's got anxiety and also ADHD, maybe the primary disability category is other health impaired ADHD, but I still have to address the social emotional pieces. The tricky part with all of this is very often a lot of my kids who truly do have significant mental illness are also really, really smart, and they may have passing grades. And so districts very often will say, well, we can't identify them because they have passing grades. And that is absolutely not true.
Yeah. They're performing well. Their grades are good. They're performing well academically.
Their grades are, and grades are the grades.
Is the big lie of this whole thing,
Right. And, special education is more than just academics. It's the social emotional, it's communication, it's behavioral, it's adaptive skills. And all of those things need to be addressed, regardless of the primary disability category. And just so people are aware, it's actually in the law that even if the child is passing from grade to grade, they might still need special education services. So it's in black and white. So I think it's just a common misconception. But absolutely, we can address all their needs. I can have a child whose primary disability is autism, but has a reading disability. And even if their primary disability category is autism, we have to include special services for the reading, if that's a need.
If that's a need. Dana, go ahead.
Diane, get the, oh my God, I just lost my train of thought. Shoot, I'm sorry. I'll interrupt again later. It just went right out of my head. Sorry.
Okay. Who wants to jump in here about?
Oh, I know what it was. I remembered. Okay. Sorry, I remembered.
Good.
Do you get that? Do you get the, well, they get good grades when they're here. That's my favorite. Yeah. They get good grades when they're here. It's not our fault they can't come into school. And I'm like, hold on a second. If the child can't make it to school, how is this not impacting their education?
Right.
So that's always my favorite. Or kids who get like really great grades when they haven't been in school for 3 months, and you're like, who wrote these grades? Like, where did this report card come from?
And I think that's one of the important things about what happened in the pandemic is that we saw them at home, and we were like, previously they'd gone to school, the grades are, okay. Like if the teacher's not calling you for some kind of behavioral thing, then you're none the wiser. And then you see them sitting there, not doing, the thing. And you're like, and a lot of parents were really, that I spoke to during this time, quite horrified, that this was, that that was going on.
Mhm. It's been, I don't even know where to start. I mean, it's so overwhelming, all of it, candidly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Dr. Smaller, would you like to, Adrienne, would you like to weigh in here?
So, I mean, just, going through, the first couple of pages in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and really sort of talking whatever the primary disability is. So that social and emotional piece, like Diane says, has to be addressed. And that's really where you can get in and begin to look for services, goals and objectives, to address the anxiety, to address the depression.
Mhm.
I'm actually, I've been somewhat impressed, given the emergency relief funds that schools have gotten in terms of, beefing up their mental health area, in terms of, hiring more people, more counselors, doing some of the mindfulness training, some of those kinds of things, to really say that we have something to offer other than just 30 minutes a week with the school psychologist, or 30 minutes a week with the guidance counselor. And that seems to be sort of the pat thing. If you have any kind of social and emotional issue, that's what they're going to offer. But I feel that slowly there has been a little bit more, and a little bit more, particularly around the school refusal, more collaboration in terms of working with the outside mental health professional, collaborating, with the school to sort of figure out, how can we get this child back to school? What are the stressors? How can we think outside the box to make this a more comfortable place for the student? So, but you have to be creative, you have to be pushy, you have to, sort of enlist the whole community in terms of the pediatrician, the consulting psychiatrist, the therapist, and everybody to really sort of weigh in terms of what this child needs in order to feel more comfortable in the school setting.
Mm-hmm. Have all of you, is there any like particularly innovative program or that you've seen in school districts to combat the rise in anxiety amongst students? You don't have to name anyone if you want to. I'm just interested in, like, what are different districts doing, if anything, to support students in a new, like, not that one time a week thing, in a new way.
I mean, I would just say, I know what I'd like to see. And I think it's starting, you're seeing this in some of the literacy areas, with dyslexia slowly. Speech and language, they're bringing in the experts. They need to bring in the experts. They need the experts as consultants. They need to work on the training and the staff. Mental health is generally not truly understood. And the repercussions and impact. So I hope they bring in the top-notch people to design programs, because they're not equipped, in my opinion.
I do want to say that the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence has been working with a number of school districts, and exactly to sort of devise these programs that I spoke about, to reduce that kind of stress and anxiety, and really to sort of teach emotional intelligence, working with staff and working with students. So
I'd be interested to see how that that kind of plays out. We've been talking, we've been talking about anxiety a lot, kind of, like sort of through this whole, this whole discussion. How do you see anxiety present in a child or a teenager? And, what are some, sort of signs that, parents can look for, because I know that, anxiety, I personally didn't know what anxiety looked like until it was refusing to go to school, but there was a lot that happened before that which I thought was, stomach aches, or, and then you're at the gastroenterologist wondering why you can't, or, so, maybe we could talk a little bit about, anxiety and how it presents and how to recognize it. And, maybe what we can do, before it becomes a full blown, case of school refusal.
So, I can go through some of the anxiety, sort of a big topic. And, what we have is sort of, it breaks down into different categories. There's general anxiety disorder, or they call it GAD, which is, if you can think, the child's afraid of everything, basically. So it could be loud noises, it could be certain foods, it could be driving in a car, it could be going to school, it could be leaving the house, going to bed at night, all of those things. So we sort of
and GAD, correct me if I'm wrong, like, doesn't GAD like float, so you're sort of like, you dealt with you're like dogs, we dealt with dogs, but then it becomes something else. Is that correct? Okay.
Exactly. So again, there's a predisposition to anxiety. We sort of look at family history when we're looking at those kinds of symptoms. Right. And it can sort of float from dogs to snakes to whatever. But it does interfere with life functions. So it's not just sort of a worry or sort of a bad dream kind of thing. It's really looking at, I call it the child's world becoming smaller in an attempt to sort of avoid some of the things that create this anxiety. There's social anxiety, which is, again, the fear of interacting with peers, trying new activities, not liking sports, organized activities, not wanting to be called on in school, fear of humiliation, embarrassment, those kinds of things. There's separation anxiety, which is the fear of really separating from a parent or a caregiver. And that could be going to school, that could be going to bed at night, that could be when a parent leaves for work, or worried about that parent traveling, those kinds of things. So anything that separates the child is something that's stimulating that kind of anxiety. And when it gets really terrible, we see anxiety attacks, we call it, or panic attacks. And the panic attacks really is that sort of physiological response. We sort of talk about the fight or flight response, and you may see the tantrums, the crying, hyperventilating, kids, sort of curled up in a ball, just, or becoming absolutely immobilized with.
But when you're in that situation, what people will do is tell you, you got to make them go to school. You got to get back on the horse, and it's like the most difficult thing, to experience in that moment, and because it's like, it's hard to see pain like that, really,
Right.
I mean, we haven't talked about school refusal yet. We will in a minute. As I said, before we started this call, those two words really do not encompass what it is, the horror of what school refusal is. Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's quite awful. Piper, I would love for you to, kind of, kick us off on this discussion about school refusal, and how, a family can, work with the school, work with your providers, because, mental health, maybe unlike, some other, it is really a situation where, you have medical professionals, you have the school, you have everyone needing to work in concert together in order to, deal with, the situation that's this child is struggling with. So, if you could start this discussion off on school refusal and, it really like what to do, I mean, like what to do in that moment.
So what the school recommends is often not what to do, right? So districts can be exceedingly aggressive, and you're going to get attendance notes and threats, and DCF can be called. Their concern is they don't understand school avoidance and school refusal. When you do a FERPA request and look back in the documents, there have been documented problems for a long time. It did not just occur. And when you look back, you can forensically put together why this is likely occurring. Districts are on notice for a very long time that this is occurring. Oftentimes, the district's response is we'll send someone to your home, which I consider to be kidnapping. This child is terrified. It's not kidnapping, it's very dramatic, but this child is terrified.
Right.
So you're going to send people into the home to get them to further humiliate them. That is always a concern, that they don't understand what this is. So it really needs to be handled sensitively. I have a case right now, school refusal, school avoidance. It's handled a high school student to get rewards for teddy bear. It's a bright kid. They don't understand what this is. That's why the experts need to come in. If a student truly deteriorates to his point of school refusal, you get avoidance first and refusal. There's often some really significant reasons as to why. That has to be determined. And student will often need, in my opinion, placement and diagnostic placement. It's this idea that sometimes, like a child, you say go to school, you go to school, or else. That's not how it works. This child is suffering. This family is suffering.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for it. And that has to be determined, likely in a diagnostic placement. And parents need to stop being judged as if it's their fault. And as I mentioned before, so I'm saying a lot of words here, it's often a child find violation. There's often many other issues. It's not just emotional disturbance. And they've been overlooked for years. Students can often be targeted or bullied. That's a red flag. Red flag there as to why they think that's occurring. So, yeah, there are hard cases, but they often do require therapeutic outplacements.
Let's, you mentioned, diagnostic, a diagnostic placement, which is like one of my questions on the second page. Can you talk a little bit about, like what is a diagnostic placement? What's an example of diagnostic placement? What is that? How is it different than, a therapeutic school placement, or, or a, kind of, a mental health intervention, like an intensive outpatient program, for example,
Right. So IOPs are only for extreme cases when the psychiatrist thinks that's needed. Otherwise, it's not. What needs to occur, though, is sometimes, right, is a therapeutic diagnostic. It's a way to get the kid into a placement that's therapeutic, small student to teacher ratio, where they can be evaluated so that more time is not lost. And if a district will agree to that in an appropriate program, that is the way to go. Because those are often turned over into permanent placements.
Are those
therapeutic placements will
sorry.
do a diagnostic, though. I'm sorry, not all therapeutic placements will even do a diagnostic, though. So you do have to be cautious about what you're looking for and where you are looking. So, and while they do turn into, often, as Piper said, the placement, they're not stay put. So I know that opens a whole other can of worms, but they're not. So if they go to the diagnostic placement and the school district says, no, we don't think it was right, and pulls them back, you have slightly less leverage, but it's, that's a legal construct that's not as important when we're talking about the the mental health piece. But, it is tough to find a place that's willing to do a diagnostic placement sometimes that is right for your child. So
yeah.
And
everyone
just
to be clear, diagnostic placement is short term. So it's for 8 weeks. And as Dana said, it's not stay put. So if there's a disagreement about where the child should go at the end of that time, the child doesn't automatically get to stay there just because there's a disagreement and someone filed for a hearing.
Right.
However, it is a good interim step. I'm usually happy, even if it's a diagnostic and I'm thinking, oh, but it needs to be a straight up placement.
Yeah.
I'll take the diagnostic because it gets us in the door. We can actually see how the child does. And it's usually faster. to get the district to agree to
The
a diagnostic
and the other,
placement.
yeah.
Yeah, because they know there's no stay put attached to that.
Right, right. I had a parent once deal with that by not picking up their child from the diagnostic placement. I mean, I would not necessarily recommend that, but they were really in between a rock and a hard place, as far as that's concerned. Just for example, because I don't like, I'm not, familiar in this area, like, where, are, like, what are places where one would that would accept a diagnostic placement? Are they placement centers? Are they only doing diagnostic placement? Are they, are they schools? What kind of centers are doing those?
A lot of schools will do them. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Dana.
I was going to say it's more, the diagnostic placement is more of the legal construct. So we're allowing them to place them for up to 8 weeks so that we can gather more information.
Mhm.
So it's not so much
Okay.
about, it's not like clinical. It sounds more clinical, like you're sending them someplace that has a diagnostic placement.
Yeah.
It's it's the school district agreeing to place diagnostically. So it's not the
Yeah.
center. You could diagnostically place a child in the substantially separate classroom in your school.
Right.
It doesn't have to be outside of the school. So a diagnostic placement technically is about gathering information.
Uh-huh.
And some of that information that we're gathering is, how does the child do in this environment?
Right.
And it doesn't have to be that they're necessarily taking data on everything. It depends on what the purpose is.
Right.
But it's to gather more information. And part of that information is, how does this child do with this type of instruction?
Mhm.
So it's, 6 to 8 weeks. It's a process. But it's definitely, I agree with Diane. It's absolutely a great way to start and to get your foot into the door,
Mhm.
if that's what your child needs.
Yeah, so I have never had a out-of-district diagnostic placement not turn into a PPT placement ever. And maybe it's used a different way, right? And sometimes they realize there's a problem. If there's a diagnostic placement referral, I see it as a safe face.
Mhm.
It's an acknowledgement they failed.
Mhm.
And that means that you don't have the present levels of performance, which is why this is required, which is why, again, I know everybody has different experiences. I've never seen a diagnostic placement not converted to private.
Mhm.
I've only seen
out of
it
district.
when the parent didn't have counsel. So when a parent comes to me and they had a diagnostic placement that was great, and then they went back to school, and I'm like, I'm sorry, what happened?
Yeah.
And like, no, it's great. They got all this great information and they went back to the public school. I'm like,
Yeah.
why didn't they
do
say that?
that?
Well, they
Yeah.
told me it was diagnostic, so it had to end in 8 weeks. So that's, to your point, Piper, yeah, I agree with you, but I've had many clients come to me who have had diagnostic placements who are then put back in the public school, and the parents are told, nope, that's just a short-term
Right.
thing to see if we can,
Right.
whatever. So that's what, I know.
Well,
So
that's
I can see their
interesting.
head is about to explode.
Yeah.
So.
That's really interesting. And something I didn't know. I learn things every day, especially when I do these panels with you. This kind of moves, we've also danced around this topic a bit, to the topic of school refusal, which I said before, is a phrase that does not, really encompass, what school refusal is, and sort of the horror that it is actually. I will very often, meet families where, the child has been in a school refusal situation for, 6 months, 8 months, a year, that kind of thing. So, let's talk about school refusal. What is it? What do we do when we're confronted with it? What do we do with school refusal when we are confronted with it in a child that hasn't been previously diagnosed with, a learning disability? Who wants to start? I don't even know. Adrienne, Dr. Smaller?
So I think we mentioned before we started today that school refusal doesn't really describe it. We used to call it school phobia. basically.
Mhm.
So fear of going to school, fear of leaving the house, it's sort of hard to sort of figure out where it began. There are certain triggers. And again, we mentioned some of that. It could be bullying, it could be humiliation, it could be an underlying learning disability. Certainly with the pandemic, we saw fear of death, fear of the death of a loved one, fear of failure. And we talked about the humiliation. And it does center really on almost like a full-blown panic attack when a child is refusing. And what do you do, as a parent? So, enlist, certainly I recommend starting with a pediatrician, moving toward a mental health professional, some guidance in terms of helping the child to begin to verbalize what is so frightening and what is so scary for them. And then working with the school, I'm always optimistic, working with the school team in terms of what they've observed when the child's been in school. What are some of the stressors, really talking to the child about what are the stressors, and trying to come up with some kind of plan where maybe it's not going to the cafeteria, maybe it's entering school at a later time, maybe it's really checking in, starting with guidance. If we can get the child into school, there are a number of different ways that we've sort of figured out how to make that child as comfortable as possible. When all else fails, and it's my understanding, Piper and Dana and Diane, that a child has to be out of school for 2 weeks before any kind of homebound instruction begins. And so the child has to essentially be out of school before any kind of educational outreach has really begun. And that's where things get so murky. And maybe you all could speak to that, just in terms of homebound instruction isn't really homebound instruction. And during the pandemic, it was virtual instruction. It could be meeting at the library, it could be meeting at the community center, at whatever. And the child's entitled to 2 hours a day of homebound instruction. And then, and I consider that almost the diagnostic placement. Then what are we going to do, and where do we need to look? And maybe you all can speak to
Diane,
that.
do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what I do suggest, parents have to be careful regarding having their kids out of school, because the state permits parents to excuse a child's absences for 10 days. So there can be 10 excused absences waived by the parents, send in a note. After that, you generally need doctor's notes, or they'll be deemed unexcused absences. And once you have a certain number, I think it's like 4 unexcused absences in a month or 10 unexcused absences in a school year, the district starts to talk about educational neglect. And that's even if the reason the child's out is because of their disability. So the reason I say this to parents is not to scare them, but to make sure that they get those doctor's notes. And if the child is out because of anxiety or difficulties with school, there are a couple things. If the child doesn't already have an IEP, I suggest referring them to a PPT immediately.
Exactly.
Yeah, get a PPT immediately. Yes, exactly. And just to be aware that the state does say if the child's academic performance, behavior, or attendance is unacceptable or even marginal, you're supposed to convene a PPT. Most districts won't. It typically is parent request. Send it in writing to an email to your special ed director, and get that going. The other thing is be sure to document the concerns to the school. So if my child is home, first of all, I had a rule in my house that if you had a fever, you could stay home. Other than that, you were going. At the same time, I was one of those families that ended up with an outright school refusal situation, and there was nothing I could do. My daughter was 15. I couldn't, restrain her, put her in a car seat and take her to school.
Mhm.
And that would have been traumatizing anyway. So that would have been the wrong way to go. But I needed to make sure that I let the district know my child's refusing to go to school because her program isn't appropriate.
Mhm.
Please help. So I sort of threw it back on them
Mhm.
that, I need you to help me come up with a solution for this. And in her case, the solution was a different placement. The placement she was in was not meeting her needs, and it wasn't ever going to meet her needs. It was too big. She needed small classes, things like that. So, but to put it back on the school district, so they're not saying, oh, your parents who are just letting your kids run wild, you don't care, it's educational neglect, we're calling DCF. Make sure that you've said it's because of the disabilities and the needs aren't being met at this point, and how are we going to fix this? And in terms of homebound instruction, we have had doctors and therapists write recommendations for homebound instruction.
Mhm.
And that's helpful too, because if I have a child who's out, if I am asking the district to provide homebound instruction, clearly I am not neglecting my child.
Right.
I want my child educated. I'm asking the school district for help.
Mhm.
So that's part of the step in the process as well.
And DCF doesn't always understand that. So, it's definitely something that I've had that happened to a lot of clients where they get the call or they get the letter or DCF is suddenly on their doorstep. And I've, knock on wood, I've never had a problem dealing with DCF once I get in. I mean, I'm also a foster parent, so I'm very familiar with DCF and how they work. But I think once we as the advocates attorneys get involved, we can navigate that for parents, but it's incredibly scary. And the tactics that schools are using to ward off families and providing services right now is candidly kind of disgusting.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that happens. Your kid is home and they just go after you for truancy.
Mhm.
There's another piece as homebound though that I think is really important. Homebound might be better than being in the public school classroom for a lot of kids. It should not be a long-term placement.
Mhm.
If we all want to know about it, Adam Lanza was on Homebound for a really long time.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah.
So, that is not an appropriate placement
Mhm.
for almost all kids.
Mhm.
It is a beautiful, wonderful interim thing that we can implement when a child can't get to school and we need some kind of something in their life, but they're not getting a whole program. They're getting 1 to 2 hours a day, maybe, of tutoring, not even a special ed teacher necessarily. It's whoever they can find who's willing to do it after school. It's not a placement. I think of it as it's a nice interim.
Right.
I'm glad we have it.
It's a holding pattern. It's a holding.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a holding pattern. Exactly. And candidly, not always a useful one. So, I agree with Diane. Yes, if you need to make those requests, you need to be on top of those things. A lot of times too, it's important to remember that there is a process. And if you as a parent don't follow the right process, you might either relinquish rights or put yourself in a position that might not be as strong. And that's really hard when you're in crisis with your kids. And I do also get a lot of clients who are like, I don't have time to be finding them a note and figuring this out. And I get it. And I agree. Because I've been there.
Yeah.
But if we don't follow these processes, I can't get you anything.
Yeah. I always say that to families. Like, it's like the school is not a person. It is a agency. It is like the DMV, like you would never go to the DMV and expect anybody to do anything for you unless you had all your paperwork in the right order and you stood in the right line and then the other line and then the other line. And the school, unfortunately is the school system is exactly the same, particularly in regards to special education and particularly in with regard to, these rights that our children have. It's like, they're not going to do anything unless you stand in the right line, with the right.
And how many of us have spoken to parents and that for the child who's been out 3 or 4 months, and you say, well, what about homebound instruction? And the parent says, what's that?
What's that? Yeah. Happens all the time.
That's always a great
Right.
one. Nobody even
And
mentioned
a lot of them think it's homeschooling, which
Yes,
is different.
yes,
So
absolutely.
homeschooling, I always say homeschooling's great if you wanted to homeschool. If your entire life you said, I just want to teach my kids, wonderful.
Right.
Some parents say, oh, I'm going to have to homeschool, but they don't really want to. And I say, okay, ding, ding, ding. This means that we need to do a different program. Homebound instruction, the child is still part of the district, but the district pays for someone to go teach your child, either usually at the library or rarely at the home, but usually somewhere neutral.
Yeah. Like
but,
a community center or something.
Yeah. So homeschooling. So some parents will go to the district and say, I'd like to homeschool my child. And just so you know, in special eddies, that means they have no responsibility for your child. So what you're looking for is homebound instruction.
Yeah.
Mhm. And schools will tell parents they can homeschool their child if they want. And I've had parents call me and say, they told me the only option I have is to homeschool. I'm like, some of the stuff I'm hearing right now is just, you can't even make it up.
Yeah.
You know?
Can you talk about, for, all of you, can you talk about like for a child that, is experiencing, a severe, school refusal situation, anxiety, depression based, what is the school's responsibility in terms of like an intensive outpatient program, an IOP, or a, therapeutic school or program? What is this, or like even a wilderness program, for example? Somebody mentioned wilderness in the chat. What's the school district's responsibility, in all of these, with all of these placements?
Yeah, so it's going to turn back on the private provider, right? And if their child is seeing an IOP and they think, or it was in the hospital and they require an IOP, that's an insurance issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then the school will pay for the academic program. The question after the IOP discharge is what kind of program? Districts absolutely do and end up paying for therapeutic day programs. And yeah, they do. So it's all going to turn on your experts and what the recommendations are.
And residential programs.
And 100% therapeutic residential. Yeah,
Right.
and that's the majority of my practice are these therapeutic placements.
Right. And I do want to say that the Yale Children's Psychiatric Service at Yale New Haven, just because I'm on the board of we have a school, a special education school on the unit, and districts are not responsible for the educational program until after 2 weeks. And then districts then begin to pay for the educational program on the inpatient unit. Mm-hmm. We provide that service anyway, because that's part of the therapeutic program. But it's very interesting. There are some districts who will pay from day one. And if you know anything about length of stay can be anywhere between 2 days and 4 days. Rarely do we get, not the longer placements that we used to, although we've had children on the unit for months at a time. So I do want to say that they are required to pay for that educational piece on the inpatient unit.
When is a therapeutic school placement appropriate for a student identified, who's for special education, who's struggling with mental health challenges? Like, when is that because I know, many parents, as you look at the continuum of, of support for a child that's struggling, and you're like, okay, we're in the, the public school with an IEP, that's not working. There's private special education school, meant to deal with dyslexia, autism, whatever. There's that. Then there's the therapeutic day program. Then there's the residential therapeutic program. Then so, can you talk about that continuum and, what, when are those programs appropriate for kids? That's a really open-ended question. I apologize.
I mean, I might, so the criteria for me is when everything on an outpatient basis has been exhausted
Mhm.
and that we're still not seeing progress. That usually it means numerous hospitalizations for suicidal ideation. We're talking about, very, very severe cases. We're talking about kids who have taken off from a day program, that they really need a 24/7. So when families have exhausted inpatient hospitalization, partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient treatment, psychotherapy, family therapy, group therapy, when all of that's available has been exhausted on an outpatient basis,
And it's
and
still
we're
not
still
working.
not seeing progress for this child, then we're talking about a 24/7 therapeutic environment that provides daily psychotherapy, daily group therapy, medication management, academics, a level program of engagement, and staff and availability 24/7.
Mhm.
Right, and that's for a residential placement. Districts will often argue that they're not responsible for the residential piece, that they will, at most will cover the educational piece. In fact, if the student needs the 24/7 care and
To access that piece. Yeah.
to access it, then they need to cover both. Not to say it's not going to be a fight. I mean, actually, I shouldn't say that. I've had a couple districts place residentially through the PPT. I will say that's very unusual. So, typically you end up going to mediation, working out an agreement.
Yeah.
But just so people are aware, the district is responsible for both the residential and the educational if that's actually needed.
That therapeutic.
I think Piper can speak more to it probably because she probably has more cases on this than I do, but we don't have great case law for residential either in Connecticut. So it is a challenge for us as attorneys to try and get it. But, for kids who need it. Also, there's another piece which sometimes people forget is if the school that the child needs is not close enough to drive to,
Yeah.
then the school is responsible to pay the boarding costs, because if that's the school they need and it's 2 hours away, the parent can't be expected to pay for that just because the school doesn't want to whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's another piece that I think people forget is, if that school that's right for them is far away, that might be the reason they need the residential.
Right.
So,
and if they, and there's actually, a number of people on this, call that are from, outside of the area that we're in. And I think it's important, and this, segues a little bit into, next month's webinar. But if there's not a school in your area, your school district has a responsibility to find that school. And that is where an educational consultant who knows the full spectrum of placement options across the country can be and should be utilized by the district at the district's expense to find the right placement for your child.
right. And I'm excited for that webinar actually, because
Oh, fantastic. So am I.
we have a lot of there are a lot of educational consultants out there though, that who work for non-special ed kids, right?
Yes,
so there
right.
are educational consultants out there. So it's really important as a parent to understand the difference between someone who can help you find
A special
something to address your
education
child.
therapeutic outplacement,
Exactly.
or a boarding school, for typical kids.
Exactly.
So that's absolutely, that is a crucial, crucial piece of it. It is 8:20. And I have, really, really enjoyed this conversation, this dialogue. I hope that all of our respondents, all the participants in the Zoom have enjoyed it as well. All of you are fantastic. This has been a real pleasure to have this discussion with you on such an important topic at such an important time. If you have any, questions about Special Education Legal Fund, please visit our website, which is www.spedlegalfund.org. Thank you everyone again for attending this webinar, to Dr. Smaller, to attorneys Johnson and Paul, and to Advocate Willcutts. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening for this panel.
Been a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for doing this. Thanks for doing these
you.
sessions. They're great. Thanks so much. Have a